Hey everybody, Bobby Medina here with my dear friend Paul Barron. We're bringing you guys another exclusive and super cool interview with somebody really special. And I'll let Paul tell you a little bit more about him.
Well, hi everybody. This is really extra special for me. Gary and I go back a lot of years, and I was so inspired to study with him. But it's not about me. I want to tell you about Gary, and we'll talk more about our history maybe throughout this. So Gary is originally from Portland, Oregon. I'm going to have to read this, Gary. I'm sorry. There's
It's
so much
okay.
wealth of stuff here.
I've forgotten all of it anyway.
Well, this is a board for people over 50, so that's that's all right. Um,
Thanks for
he,
the reminder.
I'm in your corner, buddy. So he was a member of the nationally acclaimed group Seldom Six, a Dixieland band, where he was swinging, playing, and tap dancing his way across the country with this group. Uh,
At 13.
at
Let's clear that
13,
up.
right, and the group was for 12 to 14-year-olds, I understand.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
in Gary's last year of high school, he performed as principal and soloist of the Portland Youth Symphony. His main teacher throughout, for how many years, Gary? A decade or so with Fred
I think
Sauter?
about 7 or 8 years.
7 or 8 years with Fred Sauter, principal trumpet of the Portland Symphony for 38 years, I believe.
That's right. That's right.
Um,
Now the Oregon Symphony.
Okay. And in the 80s, then Gary moved to Canada and played over 100 ITV concert TV specials with, you name it, everybody from Doc Severinsen, um, Ray Charles, Paul Anka, Tom Jones, on and on and on, hundreds of them. And then what year? I didn't see that on your bio, but Gary moved down to Vancouver, British Columbia, where we met eventually. And
1976.
76, okay. So I think I started studying in 77, the year after. Tons of TV shows, big specials in Vancouver as well. Tom Jones and Paul Anka, they did their TV series there. Gary's also played in the big bands of Stan Kenton, Louis Bellson, the Dorsey Brothers, Clark Terry, Dark Severinsen. From 75 to 1992, Gary taught at University of British Columbia, University of Alberta, and a lot more. I'm just going to skip ahead here. Uh,
Is
and
everybody
from,
bored yet?
I'm not. This is exciting. From 1995 to 2014, Gary wrote hundreds of arrangements and compositions for orchestras like Toronto Symphony, the National Arts Center in Ottawa, Vancouver Symphony, Memphis Symphonies. Let me see, 95, wrote a tribute show, the Harry James, I'm sorry,
Tribute to Harry James.
thank you, I can't read my own writing. In 98, wrote another show called Trumpet Greats, and in 2004, a show called Swingmatism, which I was happily involved in. We did a whole week at the Arts Club Theater in Vancouver in, I think, 2004 as well. And then that same year, 2004, he debuted and played with the New York Pops Orchestra by personal invitation from Skitch Henderson. Let me see. You're
At Carnegie.
at Carnegie
That was
Hall.
at Carnegie.
Yes.
My
2011.
big break that never happened.
And how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. He's written many compositions, also for his wife and orchestra, playing harp. And that was, let me see, where is? I don't have the name of that, Gary. I'm sorry. The
Which?
piece that you wrote for Gosia and the
Uh,
orchestra
Concerto Romantico.
from the book Master and Margarita, I think it was, right?
Oh, well, that was the first one. Actually, that
Oh,
was the
okay.
first for solo harp and orchestra, and then the second one. I wrote a second one for her called
Oh,
Concerto.
okay. Well, and the last thing I'll just jump ahead is the 2020, your newest composition, the Concerto for Trumpet and Orchestra, dedicated to your longtime teacher and mentor, Fred Sauter. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Paul. I actually wrote a musical 3 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please
No,
talk
it's
about that
okay.
too.
It premiered here for everybody that doesn't know, I moved to Warsaw, Poland about 13 years ago, and I've lived in Warsaw and still do. And the musical, it's called Letter from Warsaw, premiered last November. So yeah, a lot of composing.
Cool.
Very cool.
Like,
Well,
is
let
there
me ask the
anything he
first.
hasn't done?
Much easier on the chops.
That's right. The pen is always mightier than the chop.
Than the mouthpiece.
So much.
So, Gary, let me throw out the first question. One of the things I think we're all drawn to with our trumpet heroes and so on is initially their sound. You know, there's the pyrotechnics, the high notes, the, you know, fast stuff, but it's the sound that really draws us in. And that's what drew me to begging my mom to beg you then for lessons way back in 1977, is because she took me to a couple of concerts. I remember Bear Creek Park and in Surrey and a couple other places, and I went, I got to study with this guy. And I was just so drawn to your sound. So talk about your influences, your sound, how you modeled your sound, how you developed it, and well, let's leave it at that.
Well, let's see. I would say, in terms of falling in love with the sound of the trumpet, the first album that my parents ever bought for me, and I was about 12 years old, I think, was Al Hurt. And the album was called, I think, Honey in the Horn or something like that. And I had not been privy to trumpet playing per se prior to that. But this sound and his flexibility and technique and his Dixieland style was just incredible. It really was. He had such a gorgeous sound, and my parents loved listening to this sound. And I knew a lot of people, friends of my parents, who loved the sound of this horn. And then the next album they bought for me was Harry James, 25th anniversary, silver anniversary. Great album, by the way, very hit for its time. And then the next album they bought for me was one of Doc's early, I think Doc's Back in Town or Tempestuous Trumpet. I think it was one of his first two or three. And man, between the three of those guys, the actual entertainment value of the sound of the instrument, and I don't mean entertainment in a pejorative way, I mean just enjoying the actual sound of the instrument without knowing anything about it, really captivated me, really captured me. It was the sound right from the very beginning. And luckily, when I studied with Fred Sauter was a huge proponent of gorgeous sound. This was his, you know, and breath control, using the air in order to create sound. I remember Fred always talking about air and sound, air and sound, air and sound. Not necessarily, I mean, he talked about air and technique and air and flexibility and air and endurance, all of those things that are really important and need air to happen, obviously. But he really focused on helping me open up the sound, open up my aperture, open up my throat, open up my brain, open up my diaphragm, my stomach. It was always about opening everything. And he pretty much taught me how to play with as open a sound. Everybody knows what I'm talking about here. Open in your mouth, open in your throat, your tongue down and back. Fred never talked about raising your tongue. This is interesting because in terms of, let's say, upper register work, this is a pretty common technique, one that I never particularly focused on. And I think it was because Fred made me focus on as I ascended, and we didn't work on high notes. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later.
Sure.
And Paul, I know you're a proponent of this. If you want to work on high notes, get the rest of your lower register working really well.
Absolutely.
And that's where your register can come from. If you're not set up and secure in all of your lower register playing, you're going to have a hell of a time extending your register. So Fred would always say, as you ascend, keep everything open. And so when I ascended, let's say even up to a high F, which Fred and I always talked about as being the usable, pretty much the required usable register of a trumpet player, up to the F. To play it as open as possible so that through the entire register of the horn, your tone quality didn't change. It still sounded like you when you're above high C. And he pounded that into my head, figuratively speaking, except one lesson. I think maybe he pounded it literally. I'm kidding. Fred was and still is just a master. He's one of the master teachers. So that's the long answer to your question. I always focused on sound and keeping everything as open as possible. Now, perhaps it kept me from extreme upper register work, because I think even though aperture needs to be open in order to do that, your tongue has to work, your tongue has to move up in extreme upper register. But I never really cared about that. I never focused on extreme register. I guess what I would say extreme would be above a high G. Probably most young players today don't think that's extreme anymore. When I was a teenager, G was it, and anything above G was high note, like serious high note playing. It doesn't seem to be so much anymore. But so really, my first 6 or 7 years. Oh, and I should say, the first trumpet teacher I had was a bass trombone baritone player in the Oregon Symphony and a high school band director in Portland by the name of Jack Dalby. And Jack was a wonderful, grandfatherly type. I fell in love with him like a grandfather. And he made trumpet playing so much fun, and he had a beautiful sound. He could play the trumpet, and he played it beautifully, but because he was a trombone player and a baritone horn player, he didn't have anything above a high C, and it never mattered. So in the first couple of years of my trumpet playing with Jack, even then I was focusing on a pretty sound. He said, you want to play pretty so everybody in the neighborhood wants to hear you play. When they ask you to play a song, play a song. He got me playing songs right in the very beginning. There was technique. The old, Bobby, do you remember the Rubank book? Did you ever work through those?
Oh yeah, this brings back a lot of memories and for how I've been taught as well. I mean, I've always said there's the high register and the low register, and then I play in the cash register. That's the area that I like to play in. But you're right. I mean, I totally agree. And I think like trumpet has become like sports in a lot of ways, and that it's just the level of what physically people are able to do has gotten up, the bar has been raised a lot, and that's become a norm. It was like when the 4-minute mile first happened, they thought that was not achievable. And then after the first person did it, it became the norm, Or was it the 6-minute mile? I forget. I don't know. I don't run.
This is probably a topic that we could spend 9 hours talking about,
yeah.
or 3 minutes, the high note thing. And my response to the whole high note phenomenon, which, well, all of us are over 50, so we remember 40 years ago. I mean, when I was in high school 50 years ago, the high note thing was a phenomenon even then. Everybody was trying to play high notes in the 60s, for heaven's sake, and in the 70s. And my point was, to what end? If you look at all of the great classical trumpet players the last 100 years, all the way, start from Dal Steger, start from Herbert L. Clark, go to, Jerry Schwartz, to Bud Herseth, to all of the great players, high notes were never an issue for any of the classical players. It just absolutely wasn't necessary. They needed to play up to an F, let's say. His orchestral repertoire for trumpet rarely gets even up to an F, frankly. And I'm not talking about piccolo playing's another thing. And if you take a look at all of the big money-making trumpet players in the entertainment world since 1920, You know, Louis Armstrong had an F and not much more. And you go through the 30s and 40s, and then you get into, Roy Eldridge had the high notes, but didn't play them very often. It didn't matter. It was about everything else. Charlie Shavers was crazy high note stuff, but most of the time he played in the cash register. Now you get into the 50s, and now we're talking about Chet Baker, and which is one of my favorite jazz players to listen to still. And man, I don't know if he ever even got up to a high C. And it didn't matter. That was a cash register for him. And then you talk about guys like even Freddie Hubbard and Woody Shaw and Clifford Brown and all the great jazz players in the 50s. Miles never played a whole hunk above high C. And then you get into the commercial players, you know, Herb Alpert became a damn billionaire playing Tijuana brass stuff, which all that. So and even today, Chris Botti is probably the top, let's say, commercial entertainment player, and he's got a pretty solid range up to an F or a G, but he rarely uses it. So
well, it's when it's done tastefully, you know, like I've seen Chris, I've seen a number of these guys, and there's a kind of musicality that goes along with it. And then there's always the exception, because I know there's a bunch of people in our group that is going to say, well, in the 50s we had Maynard, and 60s we had, you know, Bud Brisbois and this and that. But it was really a specialist kind of thing. You know, there's always, I think there have been high note specialists throughout the years, but the majority of people, the appeal to the average listener is not up there. I remember going to see Maynard Ferguson concerts, and my mom just didn't get it. I mean, my dad kind of understood it, but my mom was like, he like ruins all the songs with all that squealing and everything he does.
Yeah, my mom and dad said the same thing. It's not a pretty sound. You're right, Bobby. There are always the exceptions. I mean, I stood next to Cat Anderson with Louis. We played together a couple times in Louis Bellson's band. And I'm here to tell you, this is crazy stuff. I mean, standing next to the guy, you could see the blue flame coming into his bell. I never heard anything. And I heard Maynard. Maynard had it was a different kind of a thing. Bud Brisbois was kind of different. But you're right, these guys were one-offs. Cat Anderson was a one-off. Nobody else in the 40s and 50s did what Cat did, right? Bud Brisbois was a one-off. Maynard was a one-off. So I guess what my comment to the young kids that come up and say, you know, I gotta play a double C, and I go, why? What are you going to do with it, right? And I try to get, and it's not that I'm dead set against increasing the range, and there's nothing wrong with it, but not to the exclusion of everything else. And I see, you know, how many videos do we see on YouTube of these guys, you know, screaming triple C's?
That's a point well taken right there, because a lot of people, you know, in my estimation as well, when I've heard people play, they have this extreme high register, but it is at the expense of a lot of other things, you know, sound in the regular register, pitch gets all over the place, you know, there's a whole lot of things that go along with that. So I totally get it. So getting back to your sound, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I never made any money playing high notes in my entire 50 years in career. Whether I was a sideman or whether I was in front of the band or whether I was a soloist, you know, with an orchestra or with my jazz quartet, all the money I made was making people smile.
Exactly. That's how I feel. That's how I feel about what I do. You know, I can play up to high F as well, and it's fine. It's not really what I'm called on to do. And I appreciate a great high note and exciting playing just as much as everything. But I think it's it's a personal thing, as well
Oh,
for a lot of people. If you want to be a lead
Paul.
player, you want to do that. Yeah, Paul. I mean, that's kind of. I mean, but Paul, you're musical. You got a great sound throughout your instrument, and that's not your only focus.
Well, yeah, my thing is that the bar keeps getting raised as far as the expectations for a lot of the shows that I do. If you look back to the old Rodgers and Hammerstein and Rodgers and Hart and so on back then, boy, if you had a good high D and you didn't need it very frequently in musicals, that was plenty. It was all about making a beautiful sound and the phrasing and the lyrical playing and then the articulate stuff. You had to have all of that foundational stuff in order, but now the bar is being raised. I did Memphis, and there was double C's in the show every night, 8 shows a week. You got to play it because that's what was written. And unfortunately, there are those that can do that nonstop, and that's raised the bar. So those of us that maybe can't do double C's nonstop, now I'm expected to have a whole bucket load of them, to play these shows. So it's just sort of a product of the times. And I think also the fact that orchestras have shrunk as far as what I'm doing, musicals, Broadway musicals. It used to be that there were 3 trumpets and one guy would, be there for the high notes and you've got 2 other guys to lean on and so on. Now it's oftentimes 1 trumpet. So you're expected to play everything from low F sharps. Literally, I've had things that went down to ba 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 da da da. Literally that amount of time from a low F sharp to a high C, playing a Barry sax line, then a lead trumpet line. So it's
I would
it's
never
changed.
orchestrate anything like that. I don't.
No,
understand.
it's such goofy writing sometimes that they
It
get
is.
piano players
is.
or guitar players or people that just have no knowledge about the trumpet,
That's
writing our parts.
Well, and unfortunately, a lot of
Paul, what would you say is the percentage of Broadway shows that require extreme upper register playing from your experience?
so extremes it would be starting at a G.
Let's say from G above.
If it's a more current sort of pop-ish show, I would say no less than half of them now.
Wow.
Yeah, at least that. Yeah, High School Musical had double A's all over the place, like little TV commercial bumpers in and out of scenes and stuff. So
Always
that might,
my worst note between G and C. I always had trouble with A's. I don't know what it was. A flat was never a problem. B flats were never a problem if I ever played them.
sure.
Rarely, but there was. Talk about that. Have you ever run into that where there's in my experience I would bump around that A. I'd either be below it or I'd bump up above it. It didn't matter what horn I played or what mouthpiece I played.
Well,
Just
that's
out
the
of
exact.
curiosity.
Well, that's the note for me that gives me trouble too. It's and the same thing. B flat's fine. B locks in really well. C, but that A, and it seems to have a mind of its own. One day or 1 week or 1 month, it might be the first and second valve, and then that goes away. Like it was fine yesterday. What happened? And now it's third valve, and only third valve would work. And then next week it's second valve. So it just changes for me all the time.
Has anybody ever done any research on what the problem with the A is, or is it just you and me that have that problem?
No, there are a lot of people. It's either A or B flat, maybe A flat. Wayne Bergeron has the most amazing double high A, but his A flat he just can't count on. So he goes, "Yeah, I got a great high A flat. It's Dan Fanero right next to me."
Right, the guy next to me.
Yeah, and I used to have one horn. I could always count on an A. It was just fun to play. I could get my arms around it. It was nice and big, and then I had some work done in that horn, and it's gone. And I've never had a horn or mouthpiece or combination of that's nailed it quite as well. Drives me crazy.
Anyway, at the end of the day, that would be my comment about sound. I was so focused and ensconced by my teachers, the first couple of teachers and they were all about sound. Well, Fred was a spectacular technique man as well, and I owe a lot of my playing to Fred Sauter, honestly.
So just from a technical standpoint, because we only have about 2 minutes left here, from a technical standpoint, what kinds of things were you working on physically to develop your sound? Were you doing like concone studies or lyrical etudes or a combination of different things?
Fred focused on my sound no matter what I did. If I was doing lip slurs, the most important thing, I do remember now, the center of the pitch. This was a big thing with Fred, is locking into the center of the pitch and knowing where that center is. So he would give me little exercises, and I can't remember the guy that created them, but these are lip bend exercises where you start in the middle of the pitch, you bend down, and then you bend up and then down.
That sounds like some Jimmy Stamp stuff.
Well, probably. It would be like Jimmy Stamp. And in the early years, if more typically, we all end up playing high on the pitch. It's pretty rare that we play underneath the pitch. So if I was starting to play high on a particular whether it was a lip slur, Walter M. Smith lip flexibilities that Fred got from me, and man, I was doing those. Those are great for endurance too, by the way. I read somewhere a number of guys, the answer to the question, what's the best thing to do for endurance? And just about everybody ended up talking about lip slurs.
Yeah.
And I think, and unless there's some newfangled approach that gets you there differently than lip slurs. But anyway, so go ahead.
Let's end there because we're going to get cut off in a second and we'll pick it up on part 2.